The message arrived at 300 GMT on a Wednesday morning, and it came through every channel at once. Not just the diplomatic frequencies, not just the military bands, every channel, every encrypted conclave relay, every civilian entertainment stream, every emergency broadcast system across 14 species and 47 inhabited star systems. From the humid spire cities of Prime to the crystalline deepwater colonies of the Belt, every screen, every speaker, every Neuralink feed lit up with the same thing at the exact same moment. A human face, middle-aged, calm, almost bored-looking in the way that people are bored when they have already thought through every possible outcome and made their peace with all of them. Behind her, a simple white wall. No flags, no military insignia, no dramatic lighting. Just a woman sitting at a table, looking into a camera, speaking in standard galactic with a faint accent that translation software flagged as Eastern European. She spoke for exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. She began with history. 62 years of it, delivered without emotion, like an accountant reading a ledger. The conclave's refusal to grant humanity voting rights at the Accords. The systematic dismantling of human mining licenses in the extension. The Dominion's blockade of the Sol Trade Corridor in 2271 that caused food shortages on 3 outer colonies. The assassination, never officially acknowledged, never investigated, of Earth's first galactic ambassador, Dr., whose shuttle exploded 11 minutes after she filed a formal complaint against conclave trade practices. She listed these things the way you list facts, because they were facts, because they had always been facts. The only new thing was that someone was finally saying them out loud in every language to every ear in the galaxy simultaneously. Then she paused, just for a moment, long enough for the silence to settle. "My name is," she said. "I am a retired schoolteacher from Poland, Earth. I am not a general. I am not a diplomat. I am not a politician. I am speaking to you today because my government felt that someone who has spent 40 years explaining consequences to people who don't want to hear them was the appropriate choice for this message." Another pause. "The United Earth Assembly has formally requested, petitioned, protested, and pleaded with the Galactic Conclave for 62 years. We have followed every rule, filed every form, attended every summit to which we were invited, and many to which we were not. We have been patient in a way that, frankly, no other species in this conclave would have been." She folded her hands on the table. "That patience has now concluded. Effective immediately, the United Earth Assembly is issuing a final demand for full sovereign recognition, restoration of all suspended trade and resource rights, and the convening of a reparations tribunal within 72 hours. If these conditions are not met, if we do not receive formal acknowledgement of compliance within 72 hours from this moment, Earth will respond." She did not explain what respond meant. She didn't need to. Or rather, nobody in the galaxy understood yet that she didn't need to. They all assumed they knew. Ships, probably. Some desperate, noble, suicidal human fleet charging into conclave space. Brave, stupid, easily destroyed. "This is not a threat," said and almost smiled. "This is a timetable." The transmission ended. For approximately 4 seconds, there was silence across the conclave's communication networks. Then, all at once, the laughing started. The ambassador to the conclave, a 7-foot creature of armored hide and deep-set golden eyes named, watched the broadcast 3 times in a row. Then he sent a message to his home fleet, currently positioned 0.3 light-years from Earth's solar system with 4,000 warships at ready posture. The message read, "Hold position. Do not fire unless fired upon. I don't want them claiming martyrdom when we end this." He then opened a private channel to his chief military advisor and laughed for a very long time. On the conclave's central communication boards, the transmission was being clipped, remixed, and redistributed as humor within the hour. Analysts on 6 different worlds wrote long, confident papers about humanity's desperation. One particularly popular commentary was titled "The Prey That Barked," and was shared 40 million times before sunrise on Prime. Nobody called it a real warning. Nobody looked at humanity's R&D budget for the last 30 years and noticed the gap. Nobody asked what a species with human-level ingenuity, genuine grievance, no access to conventional galactic weapons, and 3 decades of uninterrupted secret funding actually does when pushed to the edge. Nobody, that is, except a young analyst named Div, working a night shift in the Conclave's Economic Intelligence Division, who pulled up Earth's public financial records at 400 GMT and went very, very still at their desk. Div had 6 limbs, 3 eyes, and a gift for mathematics that had made them the youngest senior analyst in history. They stared at the numbers in front of them. Then they filed an urgent report to their department head, marked it priority critical, and immediately began composing a private message to their family on. The message said, "Leave, tonight, don't ask why. Just go somewhere with no star overhead that you're particularly attached to." The priority report was logged, sorted, and placed in a queue behind 4,000 other overnight reports. Nobody read it. The clock started ticking. 31 years before sat down in front of that camera. A different woman sat in a different room and wrote 4 words on a whiteboard that would change the history of the galaxy. The room was 2.3 kilometers beneath the lunar surface, in a facility that officially did not exist, funded through 11 layers of governmental misdirection, staffed by people who had technically retired, died, or emigrated to outer colonies. The woman was Dr., then 34 years old, a theoretical astrophysicist from who had been quietly recruited by Earth's Strategic Science Division after publishing a paper on stellar fusion mathematics that her university department head had called either the most important work of the century or complete nonsense, possibly both. The 4 words she wrote on the whiteboard were, "What keeps stars burning?" It sounds like a child's question. In her hands, it became something else entirely. Every other species in the galaxy had approached weapons development the same way, scaled up. Bigger energy outputs, faster projectiles, more powerful shields. The fundamental logic of galactic warfare was always the same: concentrate enough force to overcome your enemy's defenses. They had perfected this over 3,000 years. Their warships could crack a moon. Their fleet could sterilize a planet from orbit. They were, by every conventional measure, incomprehensibly powerful. Doctor didn't care about any of that. She cared about mathematics. Specifically, she cared about the extraordinarily precise mathematical conditions that had to be maintained inside a stellar core for nuclear fusion to sustain itself. A star, for all its terrifying power and scale, is in a state of perpetual knife-edge balance. Gravity pressing inward, fusion energy pressing outward, temperature and pressure maintained within extraordinarily tight tolerances. A living star is not a fire. It is an argument, a continuous, violent argument between forces that have been perfectly matched for billions of years. Doctor's question was simple: what happens if you interrupt the argument? Not by adding force, not by hitting the star with something, but by introducing a precisely calibrated gravitational resonance pulse, a wave of specifically tuned spatial distortion, that would cause the mathematical relationship between the star's core pressure and its fusion rate to become, as she put it in her original paper, arithmetically irreconcilable. The fusion process wouldn't explode. It wouldn't collapse into a black hole. It would simply become unable to sustain itself like a spinning top that has been given one tiny, perfect nudge at exactly the right angle. It would wobble, then slow, then stop. The star would go out. Quietly, completely. Over the course of roughly 11 minutes, as the light it had already emitted continued traveling outward across the galaxy, the last light it would ever produce. It took Doctor and her team 6 years to prove the theory worked on simulations. Another 8 years to develop the resonance emitter technology capable of producing the required pulse. 4 more years to miniaturize it to something that could be launched from lunar orbit. 3 years of safety testing. 2 years of classified military review. And then 8 years of waiting, of maintaining the facility, calibrating the equipment, training new staff, and saying nothing, while Earth's diplomatic efforts were given every possible chance to work. They didn't work. The facility was called Project Wraith, officially listed in Earth's classified budget as Theoretical Stellar Research, long-term. It employed 340 people at its peak. Of those 340 people, exactly none had ever breathed a word of it to anyone outside the facility. This was not because of threats or surveillance. It was because they were human beings who had watched their species be humiliated for 60 years, and they understood, with quiet and absolute certainty, what they were building and why. On the morning that's broadcast went out, Doctor was in the facility's main operations center, watching the message on a wall screen alongside her team. When it ended, she turned to her chief engineer, a large, quiet man from Lagos named Emmanuel, and said simply, 72 hours. Emmanuel nodded, System is already spun up. Target. He brought up the star charts on the main display. The primary star of the system burned yellow-white at the center of the screen, surrounded by 14 planets, and a civilization of nearly 15 billion people who had, that very morning, been laughing at a 4-minute video. Their fleet is 0.3 light-years out, a manual said. If gives the order to attack the moment the timer expires, it takes their ships roughly 6 days to reach us at maximum FTL. Doctor looked at the star for a long time. We're not targeting their home system, she said. Emmanuel looked at her. Not yet, she said. Pick a different one, something close enough to make the point, something with no inhabited planets in it. She paused. Something they love. Emmanuel was quiet for a moment. Then he brought up another star. Bright, familiar, one of the most recognizable stars in the navigational tradition. A star they had named in their oldest language, a word that translated roughly as the constant one. A star with no inhabited worlds, but one that they had used as a navigational beacon for 3,000 years of. A star woven into their mythology, their religion, their sense of who they were. That one, Doctor said. She walked to her desk, sat down, and opened her mission log. She wrote one sentence. We did not choose this, but we chose to be ready for it. That is what humans do. Then she closed the log and began the targeting sequence. The first 12 hours after the broadcast were chaos dressed up as confidence. The Galactic Conclave's emergency session convened within 3 hours of the transmission. A record, given that convening an emergency session normally required 14 forms of interspecies protocol approval and at least one formal complaint about seating arrangements. The speed itself told a story, though none of the assembled ambassadors would have admitted it. Somewhere beneath the laughter and the mockery, something animal and old had stirred. They were afraid, they just didn't know it yet. Addressed the chamber first, resplendent in ceremonial armor, his golden eyes sweeping the assembled delegates with the particular contempt of someone who has never in his life had genuine reason to be humble. He spoke for 40 minutes. It was, by any measure, a masterpiece of aggressive dismissal. He humanity's military weaknesses with surgical precision, their fleet numbers, their weapons technology, their shield capacities, all embarrassingly below Conclave standard. He reminded the chamber that the Dominion alone could reduce Earth to a cooling rock within 72 hours, and that doing so would, in fact, be faster than waiting for humanity's ridiculous deadline. The chamber applauded. Not all of it, the delegates remained still, their bioluminescent skin cycling through colors that their species used to signal unease, but most of it. The ambassador, a senior official named, applauded with everyone else. They had not read Div's report. No one had. In the hours that followed, the conclave did what large bureaucratic bodies always do when faced with something they don't understand. They generated paperwork. 14 different committees were formed. A formal rejection of humanity's ultimatum was drafted, revised, redrafted, argued over for 6 hours on the basis of a single adjective, re-revised, and finally approved. It was transmitted to Earth at the 14-hour mark. Earth did not respond. This was, somehow, more unsettling than any response would have been. On Prime itself, life continued largely as normal. The broadcast had been thoroughly mocked in the media. Speech had been rebroadcast on every channel. A popular entertainment program ran a comedy sketch depicting a tiny human in an oversized uniform challenging a warrior to a duel, losing immediately, and then filing a formal complaint about it. It received the highest ratings in the show's history. Children went to school, markets opened, ships launched and landed. The great yellow-white star at the center of the system burned as it had burned for 6 billion years, steady and warm and permanent. But in the quieter corners of the conclave, in late-night conversations between junior analysts, in encrypted messages between scientists who studied Earth's published research, in the worried calculations of a handful of intelligence officers who had spent their careers actually paying attention to humanity, a different conversation was happening. One intelligence officer named Wren had spent 11 years studying human behavior patterns. She had read every paper humanity had published, watched every public broadcast, tracked every resource expenditure she could access. She sat in her office at the 18-hour mark and stared at a single spreadsheet. Earth's weapons research budget, publicly reported, had been essentially zero for 30 years. Their fleet construction had stalled. Their conventional military spending had flatlined. Every indicator suggested a civilization that had given up on armed resistance. But their science budget, specifically a category labeled theoretical astrophysics applied, had increased by 4,000% over the same period. Wren filed an urgent report. She marked it immediate escalation required. She sent it to 3 different department heads. Then she leaned back in her chair, looked at the star visible through her office window, bright, familiar, constant, and thought about what a species with human intelligence, human stubbornness, human creativity, and 30 years of focused, secret, fully funded research could possibly have built. The thought arrived fully formed. Her skin went pale. She filed a second report, then a third. Then she attempted to call office directly and was informed that the Supreme Commander was not accepting unsolicited calls from junior intelligence officers. At the 48-hour mark, Div, still at their desk in the Economic Intelligence Division, having not slept, received a message from Wren that read, "You filed a report too, didn't you?" Div replied, 14 hours ago, nobody read it. Wren replied, "Nobody read mine either." They sat in silence across their respective offices on their respective worlds for a long moment. Then Div typed, "My family is already gone. Are yours?" Wren looked at the star outside her window again. "I'm calling them now," she typed back. At the 68-hour mark, 4 hours before the deadline, sent a second transmission to his fleet. It read, "The moment the deadline expires, move to weapons-ready posture. If Earth launches anything, destroy it. If they don't launch anything, hold position and await further orders." He did not consider the possibility that Earth might not launch anything and still respond. At 2:58 GMT, 2 minutes before the deadline, the Project Wraith facility beneath the moon went to full operational status. Doctor sat at the primary console. A manual stood beside her. Around them, 340 people who had spent a combined total of roughly 10,000 years building toward this moment stood at their stations in absolute silence. At 300 GMT exactly, the deadline expired. Earth sent no follow-up message. Doctor entered her authorization code. Emmanuel entered his. The system prompted for a third, the facility's independent ethics officer, a woman named Doctor who had spent 15 years as an international human rights lawyer before joining the project. Had been sitting at her station since midnight. She had not slept. She had spent the night reading, one last time, every diplomatic record of every slight, every theft, every ignored protest, every unanswered petition Earth had filed for 62 years. She entered her code without hesitation. The resonance emitter hummed. A pulse, invisible, silent, traveling at precisely calculated superluminal phase velocity, left the lunar facility and crossed the light years toward a bright, ancient star that they had called the Constant One for 3,000 years. It arrived in 11 seconds. The star wobbled, barely perceptibly at first, then more. Then, over the course of 11 minutes, its light began to change. And then it went out. It began with astronomers. As it always does, with things that happen in the sky, it was the people who watched the stars for a living who noticed first. An astronomer named Val, working a routine observation shift at the Dominion's premier stellar monitoring station, looked up from her instruments at 3:14 GMT and blinked several times in the way that people blink when their eyes are telling them something their brain refuses to process. The Constant One was dimming. Not dramatically, not with any of the spectral signatures of a nova or a collapse. It was dimming the way a lamp dims when the power is slowly being cut, a gentle, inexorable reduction in output that made no physical sense for a star in the middle of its main sequence. Val ran diagnostics on her instruments. All systems nominal. She switched to a backup telescope array. Same result. She flagged 3 colleagues. They all looked. They all went very quiet. At 3:17 GMT, she filed an emergency report. At 3:19 GMT, observatories across 14 star systems had independently confirmed the anomaly. The star was losing luminosity at a rate that had no precedent in any astronomical record in the galaxy's history. At 3:21 GMT, the Constant One was visibly dimmer to the naked eye on Prime. People on the night side of the planet were stepping outside and looking up, drawn by some instinct they couldn't name, watching a star they had looked at since childhood flicker like a candle in wind. At 3:25 GMT, it went out. Not a flash, not an explosion, No shockwave, no visible collapse. One moment it was there, dimmer than it had been, but still there, still burning, still a point of light that had been visible from Prime for 3,000 years of recorded history and 6 billion years before that. And then it was not there. The space where it had been was simply dark, empty, cold in a way that empty space always is, but that felt somehow different now, felt deliberate. On Prime, it was the equivalent of watching a mountain disappear. People stopped in the streets. Traffic systems failed as pilots and drivers lost attention simultaneously. A religious ceremony marking the annual festival of the Constant One, celebrating the star's role in navigational tradition, came to a halt as the officiating priests simply stood and stared at the sky with their mouths open. In the conclave emergency session, which had still been ongoing because nobody could agree on the exact wording of a second formal rejection, every diplomatic feed on every screen simultaneously updated with emergency astronomical alerts. The chamber went silent for the first time in anyone's memory. Received the news at 3:27 GMT. He was in his private quarters on the flagship of the fleet, 0.3 light-years from Earth. His aide shook him awake and showed him the report on a data pad. He read it twice. Then he sat up very slowly and said nothing for a long time. "It stopped," he said finally. "It stopped," his aide confirmed. "Stars do not stop." This one did. Another silence. "Natural phenomenon," said. "Unprecedented but natural. Get me the science division." The science division called back in 4 minutes with a preliminary assessment. The words unprecedented, inexplicable, and no known stellar mechanism appeared in the report more times than was comfortable counting. There was no radiation burst, no gravitational disruption, no shockwave. The star had simply ceased fusion, as if someone had found a switch and turned it off. At 3:41 GMT, Earth's transmission arrived. Same voice, same calm, same white wall background. Looked into the camera with the expression of a teacher who has just written an answer on the board and is waiting for the class to catch up. "That was one," she said. "It contained no inhabited worlds, and we made sure of that. We want to be clear, we are not interested in killing anyone. We are interested in being taken seriously." A pause. "We have identified 14 further targets. Some of them are home systems. Whether or not they contain inhabited worlds will depend entirely on whether you choose to evacuate them before we act." Another pause, longer this time. "We remain open to negotiation. You have our frequency, you always have." The transmission ended. For a moment, nobody in the conclave chamber moved. Then, all at once, every ambassador began shouting. Except for Div and Ren, who were not in the chamber. They were sitting in a small emergency communications office 3 floors below, having found each other an hour earlier in the way that people who have been screaming a warning into the void sometimes find each other in crisis. They were not shouting. They were not panicking. They were already drafting a message to Earth, not on behalf of the conclave, not on behalf of their governments. Just 2 analysts who had done the math, who had seen this coming, and who now had one very simple and very urgent goal. They needed to talk to someone on the other end who was actually listening. Div typed the opening line. "We know what you built. We know why you built it. We would like to discuss terms before anyone else does something stupid." They stared at the message for a moment. Then they hit send. The galactic conclave had existed for 800 years. In those 800 years, it had survived wars, plagues, economic collapses, 3 attempted coups, and 1 genuinely confusing incident involving a rogue AI and the entire treasury that historians still argued about. It had always survived because at its core it was built on one fundamental principle. The species with the most warships set the terms. That principle had just become extinct. The realization didn't hit all at once. It moved through the conclave like a tremor, starting with the scientists and analysts who understood what the extinction of the Constant One meant, then spreading to the military officers who began running numbers on how you fight an enemy whose weapon travels faster than any defensive system and hits something you cannot shield. And then, finally, unstoppably, crashing into the political leadership with the force of a collapsing star. You cannot negotiate with a gun, but you desperately want to negotiate with something that can turn off suns because you cannot shoot back at it. You cannot intercept it. You cannot build a wall against it or a shield around it or a treaty that disarms it by force. The only thing you can do is talk. Every species in the conclave arrived at this conclusion at slightly different times over the 6 hours following second transmission. and the order in which they arrived at it told the whole story of galactic politics. The delegates, the ones whose bioluminescent skin had cycled through warning colors during his triumphant speech, were the first to privately signal Earth. They had always been the most thoughtful species in the conclave, the least interested in dominance, the most likely to be found in the conclave's quieter corridors trying to talk people out of things. They sent a simple, private message through a back channel. "We are prepared to support full human recognition. What do you need from us specifically?" Earth's response was warm, professional, and specific. It included a 12-page document. The delegates read all 12 pages within the hour and responded. "Agreed to all points. We'll need time to bring others along." Earth replied, "We know, we appreciate it." They were next, partly because of Div. Div's emergency message to channel, the one sent with Ren from the basement communications office, had been received, read, and apparently passed up the chain, because at the 4-hour mark, Div received a personal reply. It was from Dr. "You filed your report 14 hours before the deadline," Doctor wrote. "I know because we monitor conclave internal communications. I want you to know that your report was one of several factors in our decision to select a target with no inhabited worlds for the first demonstration. Your instinct to warn people matters. It still matters. We hope you can help us now." Div read the message 3 times. Then they did something unexpected. They forwarded it to their department head, their ambassador, and the Prime Minister with a single attached note. "This is who we are dealing with. Please act accordingly." The government announced its support for human recognition 8 hours after the transmission. There were another matter entirely. To his credit, did not immediately order an attack on Earth. This was not mercy or wisdom. It was the paralysis of a military commander who has just discovered that his weapons are useless. His 4,000 warships were the most powerful conventional fleet in the galaxy. They could crack moons. They could sterilize planets. They could tear Earth's tiny defense grid apart in approximately 11 minutes. They could not stop a pulse that traveled faster than light and turned stars off. He knew this. He sat with it for a very long time. He paced his flagship bridge. He shouted at his science division. He reviewed Earth's capabilities assessments, the ones that had told him confidently that humanity posed no credible military threat, and he felt something he had not felt in 40 years of command. He felt foolish. How long have they had it? He demanded of his intelligence chief. Best estimate, 30 years of development, maybe more. 30 years, he said it like it had a taste, while we were laughing at them. Yes, Supreme Commander. He stared at the star charts for a long time. The gap where the constant one had been was already being marked with a notation in the Dominion's navigational system. EXTNGUSHED, cause unknown. The cause was not unknown. The cause was a retired schoolteacher from who had been patient for 60 years, and a physicist from who had spent 30 of those years building something that made patience irrelevant. Did not contact Earth. Not yet. What he did instead, what Supreme Commander of the Dominion's armed forces did in the 9th hour after humanity turned off a star, was sit down at his private desk and write a letter to his eldest son, who was 12 years old and had grown up learning that humans were the galaxy's most convenient punching bag. The letter took him 4 hours to write. It was 3 pages long. He destroyed it when he was done because he would never have been able to explain to his staff what it said. But the act of writing it changed something in him that all the tactical briefings in the galaxy could not have changed. Meanwhile, on Earth's moon, Doctor was not sleeping either. She was in her office, 2 floors above the operations center, staring at a star map. The 14 targets she had mentioned in the broadcast were marked in red. Each one had a file, population data, cultural significance, navigational importance. Every file also had a secondary notation, added by Doctor during the 15 years she had served as the project's ethics officer. A record of every diplomatic solution that had been attempted before this one, and when each attempt had failed. The files were thick, the notation sections were thicker. Doctor had not eaten since the broadcast. Emmanuel had left food on her desk twice and taken it away both times, untouched. She had the particular stillness of someone who has crossed a line they cannot uncross and is still deciding how they feel about that. She did not feel guilty. She had examined her conscience carefully in the months and years leading up to this moment, and she had found, not without difficulty, that she did not feel guilty. What she felt was something harder to name. Something like the weight that comes after a long, exhausting argument that you knew you were going to have and finally had. Something like the particular tiredness of someone who has been calm in a crisis and can now feel all the adrenaline leaving at once. She looked at the 14 red marks on the map. She hoped with every part of herself that she would never have to use any of them. At the 12-hour mark, Earth's diplomatic team announced that they were prepared to attend a summit. Not because they needed to, they held every advantage and everyone knew it, but because they had always preferred talking. The conclave agreed in under 4 minutes. A new record. Nobody had expected a retired schoolteacher. That was perhaps the most important thing about the Earth delegation that arrived at Conclave Station Meridian 7, a vast, ancient installation at the gravitational center of 4 species' territorial boundaries, chosen because it was the only place everyone agreed was neutral enough. The conclave's assembled ambassadors, ministers, and military liaisons had prepared for generals, for scientists who could explain the weapon, for cold-eyed politicians with maximalist demands and dramatic presentations. What they got was a trade economist named Doctor, 2 maritime lawyers named Wei and Fatima Al, and a man introduced only as our technical consultant, who turned out to be Emmanuel, who said almost nothing for the entire 19 days of negotiations, but had a gift for sitting in absolute stillness that people found, inexplicably, more threatening than shouting. Arrived last, as befitted someone who had been a teacher long enough to understand the power of a good entrance. She walked into the main negotiating chamber, a room large enough to hold 300 delegates from 14 species, all of whom were watching her, wearing a plain jacket and carrying a single data pad. She sat down. She looked around the room. She took a sip of water. Then she opened her data pad and began to read. The 14th of March, 2209, she said, in a voice that had spent 40 years projecting to the back of a classroom without a microphone. The United Earth Assembly filed petition number 7441, requesting recognition of human sovereignty over the extension mining territories. This petition was on the grounds that, and I quote, humanity has not demonstrated sufficient developmental maturity to manage resource territories of this significance. She swiped to the next entry. On the 2nd of September, 2214, petition 7442. On the 11th of January, 2215, petition 7443. She paused. I'll spare you all of them. There are 817 petitions over 62 years. Most were without a recorded reason. 43 were without even a recorded receipt of delivery. The chamber was very quiet. I taught galactic history for 40 years, she said, to children between the ages of 6 and 18, and in that time I had many students who, when they didn't want to deal with a problem, simply pretended the problem wasn't there. They would lose the homework. They would forget the appointment. They would claim they never received the message. She looked around the room, not unkindly. Children do this because they are learning how power works. They do it until they learn that ignoring a problem doesn't make it go away. It makes it get worse. She set the data pad down. You have been treating Earth like a problem you could ignore. We are here today because that approach has concluded. What happened next was what made extraordinary, what made her the right choice in a way that no general or politician would have been. She did not follow the statement with demands. She did not escalate. She looked around the chamber one more time and then she said, I'd like to hear from you now, genuinely. I want to understand what your concerns are. The ambassador spoke first, having been quietly coordinating with Earth for days. Then unexpectedly, a small species called the quiet, rarely heard from in conclave debates, whose ambassador stood up and said in a trembling voice that they had wanted to support humanity for 30 years and had been afraid to. There was a silence after this that felt like something cracking open. Was not present. They had sent a deputy, an older diplomat named Amal who had, it became clear within the first hour, been chosen specifically because she disagreed with about most things. She sat very straight, said very little in the opening sessions, and watched with the expression of someone reassessing a great many of their prior assumptions. Dr. the economist was gentle but devastating in the technical sessions. He had 62 years of economic impact data showing what the conclave's systematic exclusion of humanity had cost not just Earth, but the broader galactic economy. Inefficiencies, lost innovation, suppressed trade, numbers that made the conclave's finance ministers shift uncomfortably in their seats because the numbers were incontestable. Wei and Fatima Al were the lawyers, and they were extraordinary. They had spent years preparing a legal framework for every aspect of the settlement, clear, fair, and constructed so carefully that it was almost impossible to argue against any individual clause without looking either incompetent or cruel. Every time a delegation tried to introduce a loophole or a delay clause, one of them would produce, seemingly from nowhere, a precedent from the conclave's own legal record that closed it. Amal watched them work with something approaching admiration. On the 6th day, during a recess, she approached in the corridor and said in a low voice, "I owe you an apology, on behalf of those in my government who knew better and said nothing." Looked at her for a moment, then she said, "I know, I accept it, now let's make sure this never happens again." The days were long and complex and exhausting. There were real arguments, real disagreements, real moments when the negotiations nearly collapsed. A block of mid-tier species tried to insert a clause requiring Earth to place Project Wraith under joint conclave administration, which rejected so quickly and completely that the block's representative later said she had never seen someone close a door that fast. "Joint administration means joint control," said calmly. "Joint control means we are back where we started, no." "Then what prevents you from using it again?" the representative demanded. Considered the question for a moment. Then she said, "The same thing that prevented you from treating us fairly for 62 years, except in reverse. You held power and chose not to use it responsibly. We hold power and are choosing to use it responsibly. The difference is that we have a 62-year track record of preferring negotiation." The representative sat down. On the 14th day, Amal made a proposal on behalf of that nobody had expected. An offer of direct reparations from the Dominion to Earth, exceeding the minimum required by Earth's terms, in acknowledgement of, she read from a prepared statement, the specific and documented actions of the Dominion that contributed to the conditions necessitating this crisis. The chamber was completely silent. Said, "Thank you, we accept." On the 19th day, they reached the last item on the agenda. 19 days of negotiation had produced a document, formally titled the Meridian Accord. That was 847 pages long, and covered everything from immediate trade restoration to a 200-year reparations schedule to the specific constitutional framework for humanity's permanent seat on the Conclave Council, including full veto rights on resolutions affecting any species' sovereign territory. The accord was, in the opinion of every legal scholar who later analyzed it, extraordinarily fair. Not soft, fair. Earth had leverage that could have produced something punitive, something humiliating, something designed to break the Conclave's other species the way they had tried to break humanity. Instead, it produced something careful and structured and clearly drafted by people who had thought about what galactic civilization should look like, not just what Earth could get away with demanding. Amal said this to on the 18th day, quietly, over the terrible coffee that Conclave Station provided in its side rooms. "You could have asked for much more," she said. "Yes, agreed. Why didn't you?" Thought about this for a moment. Because what we want isn't to be powerful. What we want is to not be powerless. Those are different things. She sipped the coffee. Also, I have spent 40 years teaching children, and the most important thing I ever learned is that if you humiliate someone instead of correcting them, you don't get accountability. You get resentment. We don't want to spend the next 60 years managing conclave resentment. Amal was quiet for a moment. My government is going to argue when I return home that we gave too much. Your government is going to argue that because they are embarrassed, said not unkindly. Embarrassed people always think fairness feels like punishment. Give it 20 years. On the 19th day, they came to the last clause. It was brief, 11 words. It read, Project Wraith remains under exclusive United Earth Assembly control in perpetuity. The chamber had known this was coming. They had spent 4 days trying to soften it, joint oversight boards, independent monitoring, mutual transparency agreements. Earth's team had engaged with all of these proposals thoughtfully and rejected every single one with the same consistent logic. Any external control was a dilution of deterrence, and a diluted deterrent was no deterrent at all. It was who finally appeared on the 17th day via holographic transmission from the Dominion. Not to threaten, not to bluster. He appeared in full view of the chamber to make one final argument against the clause. He looked older than his broadcast images. He spoke carefully without the theatrical contempt of his earlier speech. He said, The existence of a weapon of this nature in the exclusive control of a single species creates an inherent instability in galactic governance. The conclave cannot function if one member holds unilateral power over stellar systems. I ask, not demand, ask that Earth consider a framework for mutual accountability. The chamber was tense. This was the most reasonable thing had said publicly in 40 years of command, and everyone knew it. Listened to him completely. She did not interrupt, she did not look impatient. When he finished, she said, "Supreme Commander, can I ask you something?" He nodded. In the 62 years during which the Dominion held overwhelming conventional military advantage over Earth, did you ever submit your fleet to joint conclave oversight? Did you ever agree to independent monitoring of your weapons development? Did any species with a dominant military position ever accept external accountability for that power? Said nothing. No, said, they didn't, because power and accountability are only correlated when the powerful choose to make them correlated. You did not choose that. We are choosing it. We are right here, choosing fairness, choosing negotiation, choosing a settlement that costs us more restraint than it costs you. But the one thing we are not choosing is to return to a position where we have no ability to make anyone listen to us. She looked at him steadily. You ignored us for 62 years because we had no way to make you stop. I will not put us back in that position. I won't do it to the people who come after me. She paused. I think if you are honest with yourself, you understand why. Looked at her for a long moment, then he looked away. He did not vote in favor of the clause, but he did not vote against it. He abstained, which, was the closest thing to concession that anyone had ever witnessed. The clause passed, 14 in favor, 1 abstention, 0 against. The Meridian Accord was signed at 1400 hours conclave standard time on a Thursday afternoon. 61 days after had first sat down in front of a camera in a white-walled room in Warsaw, and read out 62 years of accumulated grievance in a calm, steady voice. Doctor watched the signing ceremony on a screen in her lunar office, alone. Emmanuel knocked and came in halfway through. He said nothing. He just stood next to her and watched. When it was done, when the seals were pressed and the ambassadors filed out and the galaxy became, officially, a different place than it had been an hour ago, exhaled slowly. Well, Emmanuel said. Well, she agreed. He put a cup of tea on her desk. She picked it up. Outside the facility, the moon was silent and cold and permanent, and somewhere beneath its surface, Project Wraith hummed quietly in standby, maintained, calibrated, ready, and hopefully, never to be used again, 5 years after the Meridian Accord. Div had the largest office in the Conclave's intelligence division, which was unusual, because they were also the youngest department head in history, and they were not a species known for promoting youth. The promotion had come 18 months after the Accord, following a formal review of the intelligence failures that had allowed the crisis to develop unchecked. The review was thorough, and not particularly kind to the division's senior leadership. It noted, in clinical bureaucratic language, that multiple analysts had filed accurate predictive reports that were ignored, and that the systematic failure to take human capability assessment seriously had contributed directly to a situation that had resulted in, among other things, the permanent extinction of a 3,000-year-old navigational star. Div had been interviewed for the review. They had been honest and complete and had handed over every document without being asked. When the reviewing committee asked why they had continued filing reports even after it became clear nobody was reading them, Div had thought about the answer for a moment and then said, because they were true, and true things matter even when nobody is listening, especially then. They now headed a department of 200 analysts, all of them hired with a single, non-negotiable criterion. They had to be people who would file the report even if nobody read it. The department was called the Human Affairs Division, which was slightly misleading. It studied all species, with an emphasis on understanding civilizations that the Conclave had historically underestimated. It was, 5 years in, the most respected analytical body in Conclave intelligence, and its waiting list for entry-level positions was 847 people long. Div's office had one decoration, a star chart, old style, printed on actual material rather than displayed digitally. It showed the northern sky of Prime with the constant one marked in its historical position. Someone had drawn a small, neat circle around the space where it had been and written beside it in "Pay attention." Ren had taken a different path. She had left Conclave Intelligence 8 months after the Accord and applied, to the surprise of everyone who knew her, for a position with Earth's newly established Galactic Relations Office. She was, by a margin of several years, the first non-human to hold a staff position in any Earth government body. She lived on Earth's moon now, in the residential section of what had formerly been a classified facility, and was now, partly, cautiously beginning to become something else. Not a tourist attraction, not a museum, but a research campus gradually opened where scientists from 15 species were beginning to do the kind of theoretical physics work that Project Wraith had pioneered, now in full view and with full collaboration. Project Wraith itself remained exactly where it was, exactly as it was. Nobody touched it. Nobody proposed decommissioning it, not even Earth, who held the power to do so unilaterally. Wren understood why. She had asked Doctor about it once, in the corridor outside the research campus, on an ordinary Tuesday when both of them happened to be walking to the same cafeteria. "Do you ever think about dismantling it?" she asked. Doctor had been quiet for a moment. "Every day," she said, "and every day I don't, because the moment it doesn't exist, we go back to being a species that can be ignored." She paused. "I hope we build a galaxy where that's not true without it. I'm working toward that, but I'm not betting 62 years of history on hope." Wren had thought about that answer for 5 years. She thought about it on the morning she attended the ceremony where Div was awarded the Conclave's highest civilian honor, the first to receive it in peacetime, the first recipient in 300 years who had been given it specifically for filing paperwork that nobody wanted to read. She thought about it on the afternoon she helped draft the curriculum for a new required course in the Conclave's diplomatic training program, Species Assessment and the Consequences of Dismissal. The course had a subtitle, added by Div and approved unanimously, "What Happens When You Don't Pay Attention?" Retired 14 months after the Accord. He did not make a statement. He did not write a memoir. He transferred command of the fleet to his deputy, left his flagship for the last time without ceremony, and returned to Prime, where his 12-year-old son was waiting. The Dominion was not destroyed by the Accord. It was diminished, significantly, unavoidably, in ways that its more prideful members found unbearable, but it was not destroyed. The reparations schedule was long and the terms were fair, and Amal, who had returned home from the negotiations as the closest thing the Dominion had to a voice of reason, had worked quietly and steadily to ensure that the Accord's requirements were met. They were rebuilding themselves as something they had never been before, a civilization learning to exist in a galaxy where they were not the apex. It was uncomfortable. It was humbling. For many, it was genuinely painful in the way that all necessary growth is painful. But Son grew up in it, and he grew up knowing things that his father had not known at 12, knowing that power is not the same as strength, that contempt is not the same as confidence, that the species you dismiss is sometimes the one that has been quietly doing the math. He became, 20 years later, the first ambassador to Earth. Doctor retired to Iceland. She bought a small house on the coast, on a cliff above the North Atlantic, where the horizon was wide and the nights were dark and the sky was full of stars. She had a telescope. She used it every clear night, which in Iceland was not as often as she would have liked, but often enough. She had a particular ritual. Every night she went out, she found the gap in the northern sky, the place where the constant one had been for 3,000 years and 6 billion years before that. She looked at the gap for a long time. Then she looked at the other stars. She did not feel guilt. She had made her peace with that long ago, in the careful, honest way that serious people make peace with serious decisions. What she felt on those clear Icelandic nights was something that did not have a clean name, a kind of tender, aching awareness of how much everything mattered, and how close it had all come to going differently, and how the difference between catastrophe and resolution had been, in the end, 62 years of patience and one retired schoolteacher, and a team of people who had believed that the right tool in the right hands could change the terms of a conversation that had seemed permanently closed. She kept a photograph on her windowsill. It was from the day the Accord was signed, a still taken from the public broadcast. At the signing table, surrounded by ambassadors from 14 species, pressing her seal to the document that changed galactic history, was looking directly at the camera. She was smiling the particular smile of a teacher watching a student finally understand. Herself went back to teaching. Not a school exactly, a program run through Earth's new Galactic Relations Office, joint funded by the Conclave, that trained young diplomats from 14 species in the practical application of what had come to be called in textbooks the method, which was not, as some analysts had tried to frame it, a negotiating strategy or a psychological technique. It was simpler than that. It was listening, and then speaking the truth steadily, without anger, for as long as it took for someone to actually hear it. Her students were from everywhere. Human. They sat in rooms together and learned galactic history, the real version, complete and honest, including the parts that were uncomfortable for every species present. They learned the 817 petitions. They learned the memo that Div filed that nobody read. They learned the name of Dr. Earth's first ambassador, who had died in a shuttle that exploded 11 minutes after she filed a formal complaint. They learned that the galaxy had nearly destroyed itself through the accumulated weight of contempt, and that it had been saved not by the weapon, but by the 62 years of principled, documented, irrefutable patience that preceded it, patience that made the weapon unnecessary to use more than once. And beneath the moon, Project Wraith hummed on. Maintained, calibrated, ready. Not a threat anymore, or not only a threat, something else. A reminder. A monument to the specific, hard-won understanding that some lessons once learned must never be forgotten. That the galaxy is large and full of species with long memories and short attention spans, and that somewhere always someone is doing the math. Earth had learned to do the math